Hey everybody out there, this is Brad Gilpin with Blue Force Gear, and we're at SHOT Show 2022, and I'm very happy to have with me Larry Zanoff from Independent Studio Services. We're going to talk today about guns and movies. That's what they do. Quick disclaimer, we set this event up early last year, well in advance of other things that have happened in the media. And we are not discussing or taking questions on those things because this has nothing to do with that. And furthermore, I want to point out that ISS, Larry, had nothing to do with that incident, we're involved with that company, that production, and we don't know anything about it. And all. So I can't even talk about it if I wanted to.
Well said.
But
Well
hey,
said.
so Larry, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what Independent Studio Services does.
Well, like you said, my name's Larry Zanoff. Independent Studio Services is the largest prop house in North America for sure. Probably the largest one in the world, but we're not putting claim to that just yet. And we provide props for film, television, what we call the entertainment industry. And that includes everything, of course. Sunglasses, cell phones, bicycles, whatever you see in a film, it's got to come from somewhere, and we hope that you rent it from us.
You say you're large. Approximately, not going to hold you to the number. How many firearms in inventory?
So we consider, a little over 15,000 firearms large.
Okay. Yeah.
And then, of course, we've got, another couple thousand that are black powder firearms, which federally are not firearms, but we still have them in the weapons department. So 16,000 plus of a different variety of firearms. Probably the largest inventory, like I said, in North America for sure. Maybe the world as far as this rental kind of business. But, we haven't been everywhere in the world yet, so we're not quite laying claim to that.
So a little bit larger than your average home goods.
Just a little bit.
Okay, gotcha.
A little less than what I have at home, but a little bit more than your average.
Understood. And interesting point there you bring up. So we're saying firearms, but what are the different types of weapons, look-alike weapons that might be provided to a production?
So firearms, of course, in the entertainment industry, they are a prop.
Right.
Okay? And it doesn't matter what that prop is being used for, so we have different versions of them. When you see gunfire going off and there's muzzle flash and shell cases popping out, it is more than likely a real firearm that is set up by us to utilize blanks. We don't use live rounds on a movie or television set, ever. We only use blanks for safety and security reasons. So we'll have a real one. When you don't need it to be firing, we might use a replica, right? You've got here, this is a third version, which is a rubber. We tend to call it a stunt gun. See, it's rubber, and we use the real firearm, of course, to make the mold. We make it ourselves, and so you could actually read the serial number off of this rubber and know which real gun we made for that film.
And the level of detail, I don't know how it's going to translate to video, is amazing. I'm this far from the weapon, and frankly, until I pick it up and feel the weight or try to manipulate one of the non-functioning. So this is solid rubber. The charging handle, the selector, none of that functions.
Right.
You really can't tell that it's not an actual firearm.
We have a paint department, we have other manufacturing facilities, and everyone that works at ISS is in some way, shape, or form an artist. And so you get the people who make the rubber molds, that's a whole technology in and of itself, and then we hand it over to the paint department where it's staffed by artists, and they come up with a paint scheme to duplicate the real thing. It's really quite impressive.
That's fascinating. So we go from rubber to this, which is quite heavy.
Yeah.
And explain what this is called and the difference.
So this is a replica.
Okay.
And as you can see, it still, simulates a real firearm. It's got a lot more weight to it than the rubber does. This is what we would use if you had an act of carrying this around for long periods of time, but there was no requirement for gunfire.
Okay.
So if you don't need the real gun out on set, we use these other versions of a rubber replica. And as a prop person, we are kind of like a program that runs in the background of your computer. If we do our job right, we're actually swapping these versions out 10, 12, 15 times a day, and the viewing public doesn't actually pick up on it.
So in one scene, for instance, he may have a rubber version of this gun.
Correct.
The next scene, he may have a replica version of this gun, and then in the next scene, he may have a blank firing
Exactly.
version.
And the goal, of course, is we are creating an illusion of gunfire. That's what we're doing on the movie scene.
Okay.
And by swapping all of these different versions in and out, we can have blank gunfire that looks real. We can have guys jumping out of airplanes with a rubber so that it's safer for them, but it still looks real, and on and on. And we create that little bubble that literally an illusion. And if we do our job right, everyone watching the film goes, wow, that was so realistic.
So, talk to me about. We actually discussed this previously, so I'm going to lead you with this question.
Sure.
The firearm, the blank, when the gun goes bang, that's you, the armor. Everything that happens after the projectile leaves the barrel in the movie world, who owns that part of the production?
So the movie world is like a mosaic. There's 1,000 little departments, and each department polishes up their own little stone, and then the editor strings it all together into the beautiful thing that we know as a feature film. So we as armorers, we only deal with half the gun battle, the part that has to do with the firearm. When you see bullet impacts on a wall or explosions or things like that, that's actually the special effects department. Totally separate group of people, different type of licensing, different skill set. We interact very well together, but we don't do the other person's jobs.
So, okay, story time. So you were telling me the story of the bullet impacts of the dual-mounted 50 cal.
Oh my goodness.
So
here, I'll hand that back over to you. So again, we are creating an illusion, right? And it's very, very important to be accurate in these illusions so that people buy into it, right? And we had a scene where we had dual 50 caliber machine guns on a mount. And I'm sitting there, of course, safeguarding the firearms because we were going to do blank gunfire. And by the way, blank gunfire on a 50 cal, very impressive,
yes.
Right? And so as the armorer, we are always responsible for the firearms. We're not supposed to leave them alone unsupervised. So everybody's off at lunch, and I'm left on set guarding the firearms. And I'm watching the special effects department rig up this wall with all these squib hits, right? That's what they do. It's called a squib. It's a little explosion, and that gives the effect of the bullet hit. And I'm noticing that there's just something that doesn't look right. So I go over to them and I go, hey guys, what are you doing? And they're like, we're setting up this shot for the squib hits for that dual 50. And I'm looking and I'm like, it's a dual 50, not a dual 50, right? And so they're creating two separate lines, vertically as opposed to horizontally. And that's a good example of the cooperation that goes on between the armory department and the special effects department and so on, so that we get all those details right in the film.
Okay. Fascinating. So, we're talking here, we've shown some very realistic firearms. Now, and by the way, these two rifles that we showed previously were both from the Lone Survivor movie production. I don't know the right word. Movie production.
It's a production, it's a film, and just so you know, sometimes Hollywood gets a little bit of a bad rap. Some inaccuracies maybe that you see. A lot of times that's due to a story point that the director agrees that it might not be realistic, but they want to tell that part of the story anyway. But in a film like Lone Survivor or American Sniper, especially when it's a true historical event, we at ISS go above and beyond to be as historically accurate and correct as possible.
So great segue here into not a real firearm, but as I have been educated in the last 2 days, very big fan following, and a lot of people out there will recognize this firearm, which I just read the magazine for safety, is an actual character, almost, I would say. So can you talk about
Yeah,
this?
so, this right here, for those that recognize this firearm, this is Vera from Firefly. And Firefly, of course, was a science fiction television show, huge following, very well done show. And the gun, in this case Vera, became almost a character in the film. Very, very, very similar to, Dirty Harry and the 44 Magnum,
Yes.
right? We see this in pop culture more and more and more, that there is this fascination with firearms, and when you come up with something unique like this, it becomes almost a character in and of itself. Now, the interesting thing is, you never really know what is going to become that icon. We're just making it's another prop for another film. We're doing 110%, just like we normally do. And then it depends on how successful the film is, what people kind of feel, a connection with. And in this case, of course, it was Vera.
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I haven't prepped this question. I'm going to guess, looking at it, based on my knowledge of firearms, that this was made off of a Sega.
Correct. This was
Okay.
this was made off of a Sega. It was one of the first appearances of a Sega in the U.S. film market. Very, very new gun when we made this. In fact, hand me that magazine. This was a high capacity magazine, if you will, because when the guns first came into the United States, they only came in with a 5-round magazine. And of course, for the film, we needed more than that. And so we hand-crafted 2 magazines together to create this larger magazine. There's 44 screws that hold the 2 magazines together. And of course, this is a rubber version of it, but it became a higher capacity magazine for television.
Outstanding. Interesting. I wonder if they copied your design. Right?
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that I might incriminate
There you
myself.
go. Excellent. Well, so this became a character in the show. With your knowledge of not just ones you've worked on, though, what would you say are the top 3 most famous character firearms?
Wow, in all of film?
Yeah, in all of film, TV, media.
I would say, you can't go anywhere without mentioning the Smith & Wesson model
I would have
29,
to-
44
yep.
Magnum, Dirty Harry. Even people that are not firearms enthusiasts, if you say Dirty Harry gun, they know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
Right? I think once you get into that, I think you get into iconic guns that are like Westerns. So single action, Colt 1873, of course, is the most famous because you've had everything from 310 to Yuma to Gunsmoke to Bonanza, all the different Western, Silverado, the classic American cowboy with the gun on his hip is probably going to have some version of an 1873 piece.
Worldwide recognition.
Absolutely. And then beyond that, I think it becomes kind of a floating target because the film industry, of course, is a mirror of real society. And so when you see, the Beretta becoming a very common law enforcement firearm in the United States, then you start seeing it in film quite a bit. Movies like Die Hard and things like that. When you see the Glock taking over law enforcement markets, you start seeing that in things like U.S. Marshals and so on. So the icon kind of floats depending upon the time and the other firearms that are on the market at that given time. But I think that's a pretty good top 3 right there.
So, and while we're talking about history, so this is one that we argued out over dinner a while back.
Discussed.
Okay,
We discussed. We didn't argue.
Spirited discussion. Spirited discussion. In your opinion, what television or movie ushered in the modern era of the firearm in a production? Trying to be accurate, trying to be, from the days of this to actual gun handling and things.
Yeah, so just so you know, he and I disagree about this. I went for a feature film, he went for television. But I think that the Bridge Too Far movie was highly accurate, not just with the firearms, but with everything. As much as possible, the uniforms. There were a few things, but let's face it, we're filming it, 40, 50 years after the events. It's hard to be 100% accurate. But when you look at A Bridge Too Far, all the firearms were correct. The manipulation, you see magazine changes, you see charging of firearms. You had multiple nationalities in that film. So you had American guns with the Americans, German guns with the Germans, where in years past, you might have seen everybody running around with an American gun,
Right.
which was not accurate. So I kind of went for that version of accuracy, and I think that bleeds over into films like American Sniper and Lone Survivor that tried to stress that accuracy.
Right.
You, however, went a different way.
In my opinion, I went the other way. I was more focused on the handling, and you mentioned like reloading a magazine. So everybody's seen the revolver with the 50-round capacity.
Yes.
You know, on the old TV shows. And
Endless
all.
ammo supplies.
Yeah. And I am a believer that Miami Vice, the TV show, not that other film that came out later, the actual show, and Don Johnson, who was a recreational firearm shooter, ushered in the modern era of the high production quality firearms handling and the correct holsters and things of that nature. And
Sure.
I am a believer. That's my vote.
Yeah, and I agree. You know, as far as that goes, we should point out one thing which separates the two types of projects is Miami Vice, of course, was fiction, right? And what I was talking about in A Bridge Too Far was actual history. And so being accurate about history makes my choice better.
Okay.
But I don't disagree. You know, Miami Vice was groundbreaking, and we of course, in a number of ways. We of course are talking about the firearms and firearms handling, but when you look at the integration of pop culture music into the films, when you talk about, you know, cameo appearances of real personalities, I mean, how could a show not be good when you have appearances, you know, from like G. Gordon Liddy,
Willie Nelson,
my
favorite.
You know,
episode.
Phil Collins.
Yep.
You know, and Phil Collins playing a bad guy, right? And so Michael Mann, who's a phenomenal filmmaker, you know, he had the foresight to kind of integrate those different elements in it, and it was a groundbreaking show. However, again, when you're talking about exact, you know, historical accuracy, I'm right, you're wrong.
Yep. Okay.
And it's really
Right.
A Bridge Too Far.
So fair enough. Nice little cut in there at the end. So let's talk. We mentioned Michael Mann. Tell me somebody that you worked with on set who got it, was true to his craft, was interested in getting it right.
Excellent question. And I have to say that since we started with Michael Mann on that track, I will bring up Michael Mann. He himself, of course, is very knowledgeable about firearms, and it doesn't matter whether it's modern firearms like in Heat or black powder musket loaders like in Last of the Mohicans. His attention to detail, not just on firearms, but his general attention to detail is just amazing. And that's why his projects are, you know, they stand out. They're very special. I will also say, you know, I've had the honor of being on set with Tom Selleck, and he is, you know, the consummate professional. As far as firearms goes, he's also very knowledgeable about it. And there really is a lot of people in Hollywood that are a lot more knowledgeable about firearms than most viewers think. That's not to say that they're recreational shooters, but to be a movie star, you need to know how to ride a horse. You need to know how to do some sword play. And using and handling a firearm in a safe and accurate manner is one of the skill sets.
Part of the job.
It's part of the job. And if you're going to be, you know, at that level, that high international level of Oscar-winning films and things like that, it's one of those skills you have to have. And professional actors out there do pursue that training so that they can look good on camera.
And you brought up Tom Selleck, so I just want to do a shout out here. Magnum PI. Best television show ever.
Yeah, you know, once again, you're going to go with a television show. I, on the other hand, would go with Quickly Down Under, feature film again, and it had a little bit more of a historical element. But that's really, you know, illustrating the range of a real star. They're going from the small screen on modern television shows to the big screen to historic epics and everything. And being able to work with personalities like that is one of the thrills I have in my job. It's very, very cool.
So we discussed, you brought up The Last of the Mohicans. For those that aren't familiar, early colonial times movie. And,
French and Indian Wars.
Yep, and there are massive set piece scenes with black powder firearms, and you talked about Michael Mann's desire to have these overhead shots of lines of troops firing and the smoke coming out and having it consistent. Talk a little bit about that.
So, it is a French and Indian War period film. You're dealing with the redcoats, right? There was no United States yet in this movie. Colonies were part of the United Kingdom. And the redcoats are known. When you say redcoats, the first thing that pops into your mind is a long file of troops all firing in unison as, the officer or the sergeant master kind of yells out the commands. And in order to get that effect, you have to put actors through a boot camp. You actually train them, and it could be 3 days or it could be 3 weeks in order to get that accuracy down exactly. And then, of course, the armorers are very instrumental in this because each musket has to be loaded in the same manner. Again, we're not loading real lead balls, but we have to create a smoke effect that looks uniform. So the plume of smoke coming out of each barrel is the same. And again, that was the hallmark of the British Army. The British Army at the time was the greatest army on the face of the earth. Everything was regulated, everything was uniform. And you can see that in Last of the Mohicans, the Michael Mann version.
Yep. So, talking about large set pieces, what is personally, not ISS, but you personally, what is the largest production as far as firearms that you've been involved with? What was that like?
Well, of course, I'm not an independent. I don't rent myself out.
Right.
If I'm out on the set, it's because they are renting ISS firearms. But I'll give you this story, and I'm not going to mention a production name, but it does give you a good illustration of some of the things that we have to deal with as an armorer on set. I was doing a superhero movie. I won't mention which one. And there was an element with U.S. Marines and some foreign insurgents and things like that in kind of a Middle Eastern town square. And we had upward of 70 guys running around with firearms, all of them real, set up to shoot blanks, and they're all firing at each other. And to have 70 people running around and to do what we call gunfight choreography. And that's the time, the different events, so that as the camera swings through the scene, the guns are going off. And of course, it still has to be safe and everything. It is quite the task. And we spent, 3 weeks setting up this whole scene and doing everything. And quite hard work. You're putting in 16, 17-hour days. Then you're cleaning the guns all night so that they're ready for the next day. And it looked phenomenal. I have some military background, and it was the closest thing to true combat that I'd ever experienced. And it never made it into the film.
Oh.
But that's sometimes what you have to deal with.
So I have a little bit of a background myself with logistical planning and operational planning, and so something like this, 70 guys running around. So we'll assume 70 firearms, 70 magazines full of blanks. How many? You're obviously not managing that by yourself. How many armorers do you have there? I mean, because that's one thing that struck me. I've been on a couple of real life movie sets, not local things, big, and the amount of people behind the camera is staggering. And
it's a small army. Your analogy to logistics in the military is 100% accurate. For every person that the viewing public sees up on the screen, there's probably 10 or 15 people behind the camera making that happen. In that particular scene, when we had upward of 70 people firing, we had 70 firearms in front of the camera, but we actually had about 200 firearms on set because you have to have backup firearms in case something fails. We didn't have 70 loaded magazines. We had about 350 loaded magazines because when they go for take two, they're not waiting for you to load rounds in. We actually had a crew of about 8 armorers the night before, preloading the magazines, keeping them secure in a locked facility and everything. And believe it or not, you got guys with a little kind of red wagon with a steel box that's locked, and when they yell cut, they wander through the set, clearing all the guns and reloading everything for the next scene. So a lot of thought, a lot of effort goes into this that the viewing public never really sees, and that's why this is one of my pet peeves, so I'm just going to throw it out there. When you go see a movie, sit and watch the credits. Watch all the hundreds and thousands of names that roll by, people that have missed children's birthdays or anniversaries or other life events, and worked very, very hard to bring you, the viewer, the entertainment that you're watching. It's a phenomenal effort, and if you do stay and watch the credits, you'll start noticing, especially when it comes to armorers, you'll start recognizing the same names. Because at the level that ISS does things, there's just a handful of people that do it at the level that we do it. That can pull off this gunfire illusion in a good, safe manner that allows the crew to do it repeatedly, take after take after take, and then ultimately the editor gives you just one take of what he feels is the best scene.
Excellent. Well, and that's a great closer. We will be back with more with Larry Zanoff, but in the meantime, watch the credits. Larry Zanoff, Independent Studio Services. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Brad.
You bet. Thanks.